Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Conversation of Kings presented by NewCORE and WHYY.
Given what we've seen and given where we are, love to get your perspective, Mike, on how you see race impacting truth as we present that in the media.
Well, first, let's start with Dr. King. Dr. King in the good times, such as the good times were, and the very bad times, we have to remind ourselves that he was one of the most hated people in America, right? A year before he was killed, before he was murdered. But in the good times and the bad, he always had something to say. He turned out the press, certainly the TV folk, because he was magnetic. That's what I'm trying to say. Magnetic. Brought a perspective that no one else was articulating. Was kind to the camera. The camera was kind to him, and he believed in his movement. Believed in and doing much of their work during the day, in the light of day. And more often than not, those who were oppressing our folk bought into it. And so we saw America got to see the horrendous things that were happening in America, certainly in the Deep South, in the Midwest, and all over to Black people. It's a reminder of those techniques still need to be used. On the other hand, now, what we find now is in those days, a lot of that stuff was the goal was to repress it. The Southern papers wouldn't run a lot of that stuff. The Southern TV stations wouldn't run a lot of the video. Now we find ourselves in a situation where, because of social media, a lot of Americans are just choosing not to believe what we saw last week of white racism on steroids, when you get thousands of people stampeding the Capitol, looking for blood, right? Saying that they believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. I'm not sure we were seeing that 55 years ago.
Absolutely.
I stumbled on this really fascinating speech that Dr. King gave to the National Association of TV and Radio Announcers, their convention in Atlanta in 1967. And he talks about how powerful radio, in particular, Black radio in particular, was in mobilizing the Black community for the civil rights movement. And the other really, another fascinating bit of history is that WERD, WURD, was the first Black talk radio station in the country. And they were co-located with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the same building during the 50s. And so there was a really close relationship between WERD and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so that Black talk radio station was getting the scoops on what the planning, the boycotts, the rallies, all of that stuff. And so, and we have to remember in the 50s and 60s, not everybody had TV sets. Obviously there was no social media. Radio was incredibly powerful, and there was a lot more illiteracy. And so Dr. King and his compatriots, they leveraged radio in very, very powerful ways to mobilize people to put out information in code, similar to how people during slavery times, how we were able to communicate in code through music and things like that. So, I think media played a powerful role, and Black radio played an incredibly powerful role in the civil rights movement. Particularly, I'm thinking about those two examples. In terms of how race impacts truth, like our work at WURD is, we always say that we're trying to speak truth to power. And so what does that mean? We are, and I've always felt like Black folks are like the conscience of the country, because we really have no choice. And, there's always been this kind of, I think, false narrative in the media that, you have to be objective. Reporters need to be, they can't be caught up and they can't advocate for issues. And what I've known and what we've seen since 1827, when Freedom's Journal was created, the first Black newspaper was created, Black people were advocating for our very humanity, for our very lives. And so I think that's the tradition of Black media in general, is that we have to speak truth to power, because we are still seen as less than human. We are still seen as, violent, criminalized, we're caricatured, stereotyped, all of those things. And so I believe that our role at WURD in terms of, media and truth and race is that we just have to keep telling our stories in all their complexity, in all their diversity. We are not monolithic. We have, and to celebrate our successes, embrace joy and love and all of those things, so that it's not just us living in reaction to white supremacy. Our lives are so much broader and deeper and more magnificent than just that.
Since we talked about how race impacts truth, that also starts to define the narrative that we need to be able to push through, and sometimes through whatever means necessary, if I can borrow a phrase from Malcolm X. Go right ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really important point, this idea of how race impacts truth, because we know that, throughout the history of this country, the press has been white dominated. Historically, long time ago, centuries ago, some of the first newspapers made money by selling slave ads. Some of the first commercial media made money off of slave ads. And we know that through, from kind of like that early beginnings throughout kind of like the history of media in this country, it's been white dominated. So when you look at what types of stories are being told, what type of journalism is being produced, these things that we tend to label as like truth if it's coming from mainstream media, we know that that's been done through a white lens, and often at the exploitation of communities of color, in particular the Black community. We know that more recent studies, we know that when it comes to issues around the Black community, disproportionately covered as being more violent, disproportionately covered as coming from broken homes, disproportionately covered as being poor. And not only that, the inverse of that is that white communities are underrepresented in those things too. Like the white communities are not depicted as being violent, or depicted as being poor, or depicted as coming from broken families. And so we know that the mainstream media, does this reporting through a white lens, and often, at the not just misrepresenting communities of color, but often maligning them. And so I think one thing that is necessary, really for any sort of social progress, is this idea that we actually need to really rethink about, who not just owns media, so publishers or the people who kind of, are in, leadership positions, but also, who are the journalists that make up these newsrooms, again, white dominated. If we want to really reimagine how communities are covered, how to really tell a more representative truth. We know that those newsrooms need to be more diverse. They need to be representative of the communities they cover. And one of the things that we work on here in Philadelphia as part of the News Voices project at Free Press is we're specifically looking at crime coverage of the criminal legal system. Before Mike Days retired, I had a pleasure of having lots of conversations with him at the Inquirer about this. But we know that the way that Black communities are depicted in crime stories is horrendous. We know that it doesn't meet their needs, and we should be covering safety. We should be covering violence in our communities. We should be covering systemically marginalized communities who have been where we've seen disinvestment from the government. We should be covering those things, but we need to be covering them differently. And I think that we we really need to, if we take, as journalists, and I'm a former journalist myself, if we take this idea of holding, holding the powerful to account, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, if we believe in those things, then we need to really examine the role that the media has played in further marginalizing the Black community, just as much as government. It just as we see in many other systems in this country, we know that white supremacy is very much embedded in our media system. And I think it's really important for us as journalists to examine that so that we can begin to move forward and change a lot of the harm that we've created.
And I just want to throw out that the Kerner Commission report stated that explicitly that the mainstream media, or the media at that point when it came out, I think it was 1968, the Kerner Commission report came out, and they said explicitly that the media was complicit, was actually very much a part of creating this separate and unequal, these two societies, and fomenting racism. And so it definitely laid a lot of the blame at the feet of the media. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Absolutely, and here we are, more than 50 years later, still fighting with that, and kind of recognizing that. I think it gives me a great opportunity to bring Kendra into this conversation. I'd love for you to kind of provide your perspective in terms of, because you still are speaking truth to power, it's using a different media and being able to tell your own narrative and your own story. So Kendra, go ahead and share.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what everyone has said has been really powerful, and leading to our work, it's kind of like we have to take the media that exists and show people a different story, show people what we think is our truth. A lot of the stuff that goes on, like Mike said, like Sarah said, it's depicted in a way that harms our communities that we work in. Meanwhile, those who report on it, they don't live in the community. They don't know the people who are talking through these lenses. So for us, it's more so, no, let's really show them what's happening. Let's really show them the work that we're doing. And then we stay consistent in that. So for us, we're very authentic. We talk about young people and violence a lot. And people often have this perspective of, even us buying a new building, we're buying a new building at 53rd and Walton in West Philly. And a lot of people have, who haven't heard about us, they're like, oh, we heard that you're moving violent criminals into, the building, and, they're going to be spending the night, and we saw you on the news, but we don't know if that's true. And so when we have conversations with people, it's kind of like, that's not who we are. That's not the work that we're doing. Let's show you another way. So we intentionally show up all the time. We're consistent. We elevate young Black teenagers who, they come from the hood. They come from the hood, and it's a different light for people. So they're used to seeing our people in a certain way because that's what's depicted. And we are very intentional about how we portray ourselves, because that's how we live, that's how we see our communities, and that's what's important to us. So we utilize, Instagram and the media sources, because even when people they may say nice things about us, but it still may not be true. And so we have to do our own media coverage, as we like to say, and show people the truth about what we're doing.
At the time, and Mike, I know you had mentioned, Mike Days, you had mentioned before that, at the time, Dr. King was vilified, was not the hero that we know him to be now. And what Kendra had mentioned about being able to do a counter narrative, now we're talking about a counter narrative that, in King's day, as Sarah had mentioned, it was television was the medium, and it kind of like got out. But there was social media at the time. It was just not Facebook and Twitter and everything else. A lot of times it came from the pulpit, and then being able to kind of tease out from there. So one of the things that Kendra touched on, which I'd like to kind of go through with our other panelists, is how do we do a counter narrative if we're working against organizations that have more money, more outlets, more whatever it is? Because again, being able to speak truth to power, you got to know what the truth is and have people to believe the truth that you're giving. So Mike, being able to give your perspective, both from where you sat those years in Inquirer Daily News to where we are right now, please offer.
Very, very good question. I applaud, what our last panelist talked about and what she's doing to change, to at least to bring another narrative, to bring a positive narrative about our folks. We've been dealing with white supremacy since we arrived here in 1619, right? When Sara was talking about radio, Black radio, so I don't know why my brain went there, but I thought about the drum. I thought about the spiritual. It's always been that we've always embraced or had to embrace oral traditions. So there is that. And I think what social media allows us to do now is hold mainstream media accountable by telling our stories in our own way, through Instagram and, Facebook for the old folks and, Twitter for the news types. And I was at a conference not that long ago when young people now are using TikTok to tell their stories. So I think I'm not, I was in mainstream media for many, many years. I think it continues to be a powerful tool, but it must be held accountable. And it will be held more accountable for one huge reason, I think. Clearly they want to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing, but the nature of media has gone from being an entity that is its revenue is generated from advertising, which largely has gone away, to revenue that's generated by consumers. And that means that they've got to be much more in tune all over to what is important to consumers in terms of telling their stories. Now, what Kendra said earlier, said a lot of folks don't live in our neighborhoods, have not had a lot of association with people, brown people and Black people. But that's okay. Figure it out. Learn how to do that. Make connections that you have not been comfortable with or have not known. That's a process. But while all that is going on, I do think that social media must and will be an important tool for Black people, brown people, indigenous folks going forward. It has to be.
Thank you for that, Mike. And I'd like to go right to Sara, because I think that Sara, knowing that what you've had to be able to do with WURD, going on multiple platforms, being able to be where the action is, being able to be beyond just radio, being able to do those things while at the same time fighting very hard for those resources that, we'll say in the mainstream, seem to even just kind of just be directed beyond that. So talk a little bit about how you've been able to, if I can use a biblical analogy, make bricks without straw and still be meaningful.
So, I feel like just being extremely tenacious and creative and, trying to leverage partnerships. I mean, we work with the Inquirer, the WHYY, we work with everybody, the library, just trying to be scrappy and using kind of what could be considered a deficit and turning that deficit into an asset. So the fact that we didn't have a lot of financial resources, we were able to be really nimble. We were able to, pivot very quickly and really be responsive to our audiences and to the environment. What are the needs of the community, and really centering. I say this all the time to my team. This radio WURD is not about me. It's not about my father. It's not about Solomon Jones or Charles Ellison or any of the personalities associated with the radio station. It's really about the people. And so we need to be operating from a place that says, what are we doing in service to the people? Like, how is the narratives that we are sharing, the information that we are sharing, providing an access and resources and information to empower our community? Because, Philly is struggling. It was struggling before the pandemic, but it's like really struggling now. And Black folks in Philly are struggling. It's really criminal. It is absolutely criminal that, the poverty rate is what it is. Public education is in the toilet, unemployment, just every marker. The number of Black owned businesses in Philadelphia is like, I don't have the stats, but it stinks. So there's all of these markers, and it's been like this for a really long time. And so I really see the role of the station, WURD, is trying to connect the people with the powerful and hold the powerful accountable to the people. But that's a hard business model to make work. You know, it's hard to, because, you know, you're constantly poking and prodding and agitating and irritating people that you also need support from. And so it's a really interesting, delicate dance and balancing act. And I'll tell you, in 2020 was the first year that we were actually successful in securing some philanthropic support from grantors. And that's made a huge difference. And we've been able to do that and make a compelling argument because we are really mission-based. We probably should be a not-for-profit, but we're a for-profit. But we really hold true to our mission of serving the people. And so we've been able to continue to bring in revenue from corporations and advertising agencies and stuff like that. But we also are getting some philanthropic support now as well, which has made a big difference in order to innovate and experiment and continue to try and do outreach to the community.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sarah. Mike, I think Sarah hit on a very key issue, and this is an issue that King struggled with throughout his life, and that is finding the resources to continue to do, you know, because you're pushing up against the tide, you know, and just as Sarah said, you know, tough things were tough before the pandemic, and this racial reckoning we have is just something that's always been there, but has now been amplified and accelerated. But if organizations like Free Press, for example, or other organizations can't maintain their margin, they can't maintain their mission. So talk a little bit about how resources can make the difference in terms of being able to push out some of this truth and being able to gain traction and gain the resources to continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think, you know, at least looking at, you know, how just like the financial model for media has changed so much in the past 20 plus years. You know, there have been like real detriments to our communities as a result of both like traditional media like decreasing. Like we know that like with fewer journalists you know, we know that there are all these negative effects on a community. We know that fewer people vote, fewer people volunteer, fewer people run for public office. Communities are negatively impacted when there is no sort of local news presence, whether that is like more traditional media or even looking at things just like, you know, low power FM stations, community newsletters, whatever it may be. If there is no media in a community, it makes it harder for people to stay civically engaged. I bring that up because I think one really important thing that is often overlooked is that I really think that there are real policy solutions to making sure that both community organizations as well as local newsrooms have the resources they need so that they can cover, you know, local municipal meetings, but also get the word out about local businesses, or just making sure that people have more of a voice in local media. And so, you know, in what we're, I think, seeing like around the country right now is that with fewer resources going towards media, what is the role of public policy to make sure that that does not disappear? And, you know, whether you're a commercial media station, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're public media, you are right, the resources just aren't there like they used to be. And so I think that we're going to have to get creative about how, you know, what does sustainability look like, you know, for both nonprofits and commercial media. And I think one important thing we need to look at too, this doesn't have to do so much with just the lack of resources, but just like where like ownership comes from. I think that one thing that we're really beginning to see is that there needs to be new public policy to make sure that that media is not predominantly owned by white people. I mean, the fact that, I mean, I love WURD. The fact that it's the only Black-owned radio station in Pennsylvania is absolutely absurd. And I think that we need to really examine how are we ensuring that historical policies that have prevented people of color from owning and controlling media and controlling their narratives and their community narratives, how do we begin to re-examine that moving forward? And I think that one thing that Free Press has certainly been pushing is this idea of media reparations, this idea that the role that media has played in oppressing the Black community for hundreds of years. How do we begin to repair that? And how do we also begin to create policy that ensures that media is community owned, it is owned by more people of color?
That we're talking about policy change, we're talking about ownership change, we're talking about philanthropic change that will enable to put the hands or better influence in terms of some of the voices right now that seem to continue to fight for their own volume. So Kendra, why don't you go ahead and share?
Definitely. So we're very new. So we started our programming piloting in 2019. We my partner and I put up our own money to start things. You know, the story goes as you start your own business. In 2020, we received all of our funding. And so I'll be transparent and say that in 11 months, we've received or have been committed for over $1 million of funding, which is a big deal for a new nonprofit. And we're Black led, we're youth led. And so we have very honest conversations with funders. You know, a lot of times they come from offices, they come from places, they don't understand the issues that you're trying to work on or face. And we are, you know, we're very authentic with how we present things. And sometimes even then they want to fund programming, but they don't want to fund staff or they don't want to fund your time. And so we have to have these conversations with funders because at the end of the day, they don't know. They just know how something looks, you know, oh, we're interested in education. Oh, we're interested in this. But it's our job to help them understand what it really looks like on the ground. So we have to be transparent about, you know, this doesn't work this way. This is how this works. Also, if they have a certain amount of money and we can't get that done with that amount of money, we have to be honest and say, this is not going to work because we have to invest in the way we do things. And we just have to be more honest about these conversations because we can't keep going around and saying, you know, like our communities matter and Black people matter and all these things, but we're not really investing in the communities. So we're intentional about who we take money from, but also having these conversations with people who have all of the resources and then elevating your partners who are doing the work as well, because oftentimes we're never going to be in rooms that other people have the time and the resources to be in these spaces. So we have to elevate ourselves to get in these spaces. We also have to say, hey, funders, is it possible that you know of any other opportunities? And then building these relationships with people, because once they see, like, even if they don't, you know, oh, we have to see your work, building that relationship is so important. And then it becomes, I want to introduce you to these people. And then you bring along all the people who you know also need resources and doing the work and bringing them into those spaces as well. Because as we see, you know, nonprofits fight over city resources all the time. The city resources are super limited, but there are a lot of foundations who should be funding organizations like ours and communities like ours who don't even know that we exist. So definitely accountability for, you know, making sure people are allowing us to be in these spaces, bringing our own chairs and our tables, and also elevating ourselves and other people who are doing similar work.
What Kendra had mentioned was that, you know, relatively new organization trying to get, you know, kind of break through. How do we make sure that, you know, the moment that we find ourselves in is not just a moment? You know, I was having a conversation with someone else this morning about, you know, the fact that we're going to have the first female person of color as a vice president is completely being pushed away under the, you know, what happened 2 weeks ago. You know, and whether that's appropriate or not, that's one thing. But the Black Lives Matter movement really started to elevate a lot of this discussion. How then do we, and I'm going to start with you, Mike Days, make sure that this is not just a moment, that it is a momentum piece that enables the movement to continue? So, Mike, would you take that? And I'm only going to give you a minute, then I'm going to go to Sara, Mike Rispoli, and then to Kendra.
I don't know about the moment then, but we're on a continuum that will go on long past our lifetimes. You know, Black folks have been fighting white suppression, white racism since they've been here in a variety of ways. That what we saw last week in Washington was 21st century style version of it, where thousands of people gathered and really came there to do harm. And anyone who doesn't understand that's about white racism and how people view the world, how they worked really hard to negate all the black votes, all the brown votes that were done in the presidential election. It doesn't get to someone. Is it a moment? It's a moment for now, but we're on a continuum and we can't let it go. We have to be recognized. We have to be accepted as full citizens in this country and on this planet.
And I think it leads right nicely to you, Sarah, because that's 24/7 URD, fighting for who we are, what our humanity and our relevance. So would you go ahead and share how do we make sure we keep the momentum going?
I want to just kind of echo what Mike Rispoli shared about there needing to be policy. I think that there is a real role for policy change. The 1996 Telecommunications Act is what basically destroyed independent radio. Now you have iHeart and you have these massive conglomerates who have homogenized the entire radio industry. I mean, and I'm personally annoyed with iHeart because they just launched something called the Black Information Network, that they bought up 30 AM stations across the country and are now programming it with Black news. But it's completely white owned, and ownership really matters. And that's something else that Mike Rispoli said. Ownership matters. And the government, the federal government, the state government, the local government has a role to play in incentivizing, whether it's through tax credits or other things, to create much more favorable terms and a much more favorable environment for diverse ownership, because that from there it flows down or out, so that there is more ownership in the storytelling and the decision making and all of that. And so I think that there's a role for the government to play in extending this from a moment to a movement.
Thank you, Sarah. Go ahead, Mike. Want to share your thoughts, and then we'll get to Kendra, and then we'll keep moving.
Yeah, I mean, I think in order to keep it going is we have to keep doing what we have been doing, which is people need to keep organizing. I mean, the only way change happens in a way that that promotes justice and progress comes from the people. And I think that, even if people don't necessarily care about journalism or media, which, that's absolutely fair. We know that media plays such a vital role in promoting democracy and promoting justice, that I think that one way we keep momentum going is to continue to organize to make the media more equitable, to continue to make sure that voices that have been systemically marginalized are centered in coverage, that people who maybe don't consider themselves journalists commit acts of journalism, documenting protests, sharing information on social media, keeping your community informed based on what you were able to know. And I think that the more people who make media, who organize to really transform it, I think that needs to be done alongside and within all the other incredible movement work that's happening right now in this country.
Thanks for that, Mike. Kendra, you get the last word, at least on this particular segment, because as you had told your story about Philadelphia, or just call it, because you're going to be global, I'm sure, but kind of recognizing that you saw a need, saw a gap, got something started, and now you're moving forward. So just as everyone else has shared, ownership does matter in terms of owning your own mission and destiny. So share a little bit about how we are able to move from this moment to keep this momentum going.
I think definitely echoing what everyone else has said. And also, I think oftentimes we fight so hard for something, and then we get like a little piece of progress, and then we are, satisfied, or we're complacent for a time. And I think from our perspective, it's like yes, we should celebrate those small wins, but we shouldn't stop the things we're doing, because that's what people want us to do. They give us certain things after, making a lot of noise, because they think that we're going to go away. And we can't go away. We have to come harder. I think being strategic is a big thing. And I definitely think policy for the media stuff is it would be a huge move and a big next step where some accountability comes into play.
As always, we thank the WHYY members for making community conversations like this possible. We need to look no further than the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, and actually so much through our entire history, to see the two Americas and how the fight for injustice is as strong as the fight for justice. The weaponization of misinformation is as strong as the force of truth and facts, and how the poison of racism underpins it all, conflating good trouble with bad trouble in media narratives. Dr. King understood all of this. The Dr. King revered today is not what was represented in media during the civil rights movement. And just as today, not all media sought truth and accountability, and yet we also cannot diminish the role that so many journalists played in documenting and pushing for change.